here to learn how to grow. And this is the first of our Grow Your Own series of class in 2022. So today's lecture is on setting up raised beds and planters. We will have 5 more coming. So if you have not registered for the rest of the series, please go ahead and do that. It's a wonderful program. And before we get started, I would like to go over some logistics. First, Nancy has pretty much muted everyone's audio and video. And if not, if you could go ahead and do that yourself, this will help us in increasing streaming quality. And also know that we will be playing some videos during the lecture, and the audio volume on those videos might be a little bit lower than the presenter's volume. So adjust your device accordingly for that as well. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the box. And our moderator, otherwise known as Wranglers, and for today it's me, Nancy, and Ruben will help cue them to our presenter as time allows toward the end. And this lecture will be recorded, and the links along with the resources shared will be emailed to everyone in the upcoming week for your reference. And without further ado, let me introduce our presenter, Sam. Sam Koresh is a Fort Bend County Associate Master Gardener. And after her recent retirement as a math teacher from HCC, Fort Bend ISD, and HISD, she enjoys gardening, photography, woodworking, sewing, knitting, and ceramics. She has been gardening her whole life, having grown up in a family that values flowers and fruit gardening. She's been building raised beds for 18 years, and she uses her garden as a way to build her woodworking skills as well. So without further ado, Sam, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Angela. Hi there. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I want you to know that this topic is broad. There are so many kinds of raised beds and just as many types of construction. For the sake of time, this presentation highlights some of the most common options. This is by no means an exhaustive list of all possible methods. Please also note that many of these topics can be delved into deeply, but since the main topic is raised beds, only an introduction to these ancillary topics will be covered. All right, let's get started. Let's start by taking a closer look at the topics to be discussed. What are raised beds, and why would you want to use them? What are the essential considerations when planning for them? What materials can be used? And how does one make and/or use a raised bed? All right, let's look at our first example. In this picture, 4 raised beds are partially visible. There are 2 on the left, one in the back one in the back on the right, and one in the front. Tomatoes, squash, grapes, cilantro, and a few bunching onions, sweet peppers, and collard greens are in this midsummer garden. The picture illustrates 2 very important gardening techniques: interplanting and intensive gardening. So interplanting just means that 2 or more vegetables are planted together. The second has to do with spacing. You may have noticed that the plants have very little space between them. This is known as the intensive gardening method. Because of the compost-rich soil, appropriate drainage, adequate light, and access to water, the plants in these raised beds thrived, even though they were really closely packed together. Oftentimes, plants are planted together according to their water needs, also known as hydrozoning, and/or by their nutritional needs. So raised beds make it a ton easier to meet the needs of plants in a particular bed. You can customize according to what's in the bed. Throughout the presentation, we'll see a lot of pictures and even watch some videos. All right, let's get moving. So the first question is, what do you think? Make a comment in the comment section in the chat. What do you think all of these have in common? Let's just take a moment. Right, here we go. Excuse me. These are all examples of raised beds. A raised bed is a piece of ground used for growing that is higher than the ground around it. Often, when we think of raised beds, we think of some type of container, but mounded soil can also be considered a raised bed. So see in the first one, there's mounded soil, and there are all different types that are represented here. We'll get into those throughout the presentation. So why do you want to consider having raised beds? Some of the advantages are that they are more manageable, allow you to control the soil. They improve drainage. They allow for more weed control. This is a big one because gardeners spend a lot of time weeding. And so if we can reduce down the time it takes to weed, we can enjoy our gardens a little more. They increase yields because of room for roots and rich, deep soil. We all know that we've tried to plant in the clay that we have, and trying to put plants in clay and have a successful garden can be very challenging. So raised beds can help eliminate that problem. They prevent or reduce critters when sufficiently tall. I have beds that are short and beds that are tall, and hands down, the taller beds keep all kinds of critters out. So I might see that some rabbits have gnawed on some things in my shorter beds, but in my taller beds, they seem to be untouched by squirrels and by rabbits. They allow everyone to garden. This is important. So you can have raised beds that have access for wheelchairs. They can be taller so that you don't need to be on your knees gardening. So they make it possible for everyone to garden. They're compatible with rapidly changing production gardens. This is pivotal for me and for many gardeners because I change plants out very quickly. I grow a lot of food. I grow annuals, I grow perennials, but the food changes out very rapidly. I pick produce and then plant some more. And so because of that, raised beds allow for that. And so that's a really big advantage. They don't require a ton of space. So a person can have a patio and that's it, and not have any yard and still have a raised bed. And you can expand on the raised beds as your needs change. So say that you start and you have one raised bed, but you want more, but you're just not ready for more yet. Well, that's fine. And we'll look at some examples of raised beds that configurations can change, which is really very neat. They divide up the work. This can't be understated. This can't be ignored. This is really, really important. So with raised beds, I can work in a single raised bed at a time, and that makes the work a lot more manageable. It's a lot easier for me to say, okay, this bed needs attending, rather than to look at the whole yard and go, oh, I've got to do all this work in this big field. So this is helpful to me, and I think it is to many others as well. And they have aesthetic value. You can make really pretty raised beds. They can be very simplistic and yet still be beautiful. Let's look at planning considerations next. So what is the function of a raised bed? Does it need to be moved at any point? Some raised beds can be moved, especially grow bags, the smaller grow bags in particular. I've seen where people put raised beds on casters on wheels and can move them in and out of the garage as the season changes. Who will access the bed and what are their individual needs? Well, when you're planning, you need to think about who is going to use that raised bed and what are their personal needs. In particular, in my garden, I built one of my raised beds to be available for a person in a wheelchair to access. And so the height is just at the height that person needed. Is it safe? You don't want to fall. You don't want to have anything in your way when you're trying to access it. You also need to think about the material. And if you're planning to grow food at any time now or in the future, you need to make sure you pick materials you're comfortable with and their safety. You're comfortable with their safety. Okay. Is the location accessible and is there space to work and move? A lot of people will put down pavers or stepping stones of some kind so that they can get to the beds. Sorry, my stomach is growling. Should have eaten breakfast, right? All right. You need to consider the cost. The cost really varies widely depending on materials and size. I saw some raised beds, I did some research, and some were as low as $79 to buy a kit for a beginning kit, a couple of feet wide by 3 or 4 feet long, to $500-600 for a raised bed. They have all kinds of systems you can build or buy, and so it really depends on the materials you're using, whether it's ready-made, and how much work you need to put into it. Typically, the more work you put in, the less the cost. The location, the soil, the drainage, and the irrigation, which we will cover in just a bit. Construction and materials. Are you going to construct it yourself? Out of what materials? Are you going to buy a kit? Are you going to buy just containers and use those? So there are a lot of options. So when you're sitting down and planning, kind of get an idea of what you want and write these things down. Maintenance and durability. So there are two types of maintenance. There's maintenance of the material that you use to build your raised bed or that you purchase, and there's maintenance of the soil. Durability has to also do with the materials. As you know, the summer sun here can get very, very hot, and we have high humidity. And so lots of materials will wear over time. No matter what material you use, they will wear over time. They just may wear at different rates. So we'll talk about those as we get to those particular materials, and we can talk about how durable they are. All right. So what is it you want to achieve with this bed? Is it for food or flowers or both? I typically garden with food and flowers, and I mix them in the same beds. I try to keep plants that are not safe for touching away from a place where I'm always touching. So I'll have my foxgloves in my pollinator garden and not with my food, for example. What is the overall plan for the space, and how does this fit into that plan? So when you plan to put in a raised bed, think about what your plans are for that space in general and try to make it coordinate with that. Have you written down what it is you're trying to do? So the plan you make does not have to be elaborate, but you should consider writing down your thoughts and some of the steps you will take. Doing so will help you know what you want. So once you have an idea of what you want, you can start planning. Let's say you've made some notes and you have an idea of what you want, so you're ready to move forward. What's next? Well, we could start by analyzing the sun. So in general, full sun plants require a minimum of 6 and preferably 8 hours of sunlight. If you plant many vegetables that don't like shade, so if you plant your vegetables in the shade, you're just not going to have very productive plants. So you really want to plan according to where there's sun. The sunlight, excuse me, the sunlight changes both throughout the day and throughout the seasons, as the image demonstrates. Structures like your home, fences, and trees can shade areas of your yard. If you plan to garden year round, you'll need a spot that gets enough sunlight to meet the needs of what you are planting. I do have some beds that are in the shade, and I put shade plants in them. On a day you're home, go out and at different hours and observe where your garden gets sun and shade. This is really important. You got to know your yard a little bit before you plan your bed. By the end of the day, try to get a rough estimate of the number of hours of sunlight in each area and note that down. So for plants and for vegetables and for plants that want full sun, place your raised beds where there are at least 6 hours of daylight. All right, so now let's talk about the height of the bed. So sunlight is the first consideration. Now we're going to talk about how tall your beds are. This is important because you want your roots to have a good chance of survival so your plant can survive, or plants. All right, here we go. In-ground beds go directly into the soil. There's no barrier between the bottom of the soil in the bed and the soil in the ground. If there is a border, an 8 to 12 inch border is sufficient, given the soil below has been worked and amended. And I'm going to say that again, given the soil below has been worked and amended. Clay will need amending with organic matter, such as compost. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about the soil in a minute. Beds that do not go directly into the soil, but instead have a bottom, a hard surface, and or landscape fabric will not have roots that go directly into the ground. So they must be deeper. This is important. So the distinction is in-ground plants, excuse me, we need a little water. Sorry about that. So in-ground plants that go directly down into the soil below do not need to be as deep. They need to be 8 to 12 inches. But if you do not go into the soil, say there's a hard surface or landscape fabric, they need to be taller. And we'll talk about that. Okay. So beds that go directly into the soil, but instead have a bottom, a hard surface, and or landscape fabric will not have roots that go directly into the ground. They will need to be deeper. Clay will need amending with organic matter as mentioned. On a permeable surface such as decomposed granite, which is what my beds are on, 18 to 24 inches tall is sufficient. So that means that above the surface of the ground, they need to be 18 to 24 inches tall. On a hard surface like concrete, still 18 to 24 inches. So you might be surprised to learn you can put a raised bed on concrete. You just need to make sure that there's a way for it to drain away from the hard surface, okay? So let's talk about drainage considerations. Drainage takes into account the depth of the soil, room for the roots to grow and drain, and the area below and surrounding the raised beds. Taller beds mean you can have deep soil, which will allow not only room for the roots to grow, but also room for them to drain. Many plants need about 12 inches for growth and another 6 for drainage away from the roots. This is why the recommended, not in ground, raised bed height is 18 inches. These taller beds allow sufficient room for drainage below the root zone of most plants. You don't want your roots sitting in water or they can rot, and there are all kinds of problems that come from that, including the loss of the plant, as well as root rotting diseases. Now let's talk about soil. The soil you use matters. For large containers, potting soil drains too fast and during the peak of summer may not hold enough water to meet the needs of your plants. Consider amending with organic matter. Everyone knows that our little potted plants outside in the summer just dry out really quickly. When I used to put plants in just small planters and I'd use like a prepared potting soil with perlite and everything, I would water in the morning, and when I got home from work, they would be completely dry and the plant would be sagging, it would be drooping. And so I've learned over time and through the Master Gardener program that you need to amend soil. So it's really important that your soil not drain, not drain too fast, but also not too slowly. So sloping. The water should move away from the roots and the bottom of the container. That's really super important. Improved drainage can occur with organic matter in the beds and inorganic material below and around the beds. Inorganic material there's things like gravel, rock, and decomposed granite, which you see pictured here. Sorry, morning. Granite can be used to improve drainage around your raised beds. French drains can be installed if the area tends to flood during times of heavy rain. So I have French drains and I have decomposed granite, sometimes in the same area. We didn't have French drains on the side of our yard. And one problem we had was that the side of our yard, when we had heavy rains, would flood. So the problem was that they would flood and the bottom of the fence would get damaged. The top, excuse me for one moment. My apologies. I have asthma and sometimes it kind of gives me a little trouble. So the top photo shows a French drain installation, and the bottom is a picture of decomposed granite. Decomposed granite forms a firm surface. You may have seen it on a park trail. It drains well and is often used to create outdoor pathways. All right. Let's see, let's keep going. All right. We're going to watch a video.
One option for drainage is to have French drains. There's an initial cost in putting them in, but the advantage is that even when you have flooding and lots of rain, your plants and beds don't receive more water than they need. In this case, this drain and the others in the yard go out to the curb and empty in to the sewer system.
Right. So that's my that's my attempt of discussing things on camera. Kind of new to that, so bear with me. So let's keep going here. All right, so there is a picture of the grate. They come in different designs, so you can match your garden. But the tube goes out to the curb, and it has a pop-up valve, so it pops up so that water can exit. All right, let's watch some more videos.
So here we're talking about drainage. In a tall raised bed like this one, having good drainage is pretty easy because when it rains or when you water, even if you overwater, the water comes out from the bottom. Notice also that there's a slight angle coming away from the beds. That assists with drainage too, so even the bottoms don't sit in water.
So we've talked about drainage. We've talked about the height of the beds. Let's talk about the soil. It is the foundation of healthy plants. Sorry, just a moment, please. Soil consists of 4 components: air, minerals, water, and the decaying remains of plants and animals. We call that organic matter. So compost, we've all heard of compost, but what is a compost? Well, compost is what you get from the decaying of once living organisms and their byproducts, such as manure. So when you put cow manure on your plants, you're using compost. Compost can also be made at home by recycling your plants and your leaves and your grass cuttings, and even some items from your indoor home use. For example, banana peels or coffee grinds. Compost contains almost everything that you need nutrient-wise for plant growth, which makes it ideal to put on plants. A plant mixture can be used that is specifically made for raised beds. I mix my own by adding composted manure and topsoil together, but I'll often top off my beds with a planting mixture made for this purpose. Many of the big box stores have them. Many of the gardens, the local gardens also have them. So you can get bags of soil that are made specifically for raised beds. That's a relatively new thing in the last few years. So here are the key points about soil and organic matter. All bed types require organic matter that is periodically added. The soil breaks down and as decomposers work on the soil, and so the level will go down. So you'll need to add organic matter at regular intervals. For me, I do it every season. I look at what the level looks like and I add in more organic matter as needed. Amendments depend on what is being grown. So note that vegetables are heavy feeders and require supplemental nutrition. That means you'll need to add some type of fertilizer to your plants during the growing season and multiple times during the growing season. Different vegetables need different types of fertilizer. And so when you plant the plant or you plant seeds, look up and research what that particular plant needs and give it what it needs. Before planting, you research, try to group your vegetables together that have similar needs. So if you know a plant needs more nitrogen than other plants, plant it with others that are like it. For example, I grow leafy green vegetables and herbs, and those require a bit more nitrogen than the rest of my plants. So I typically put them together in raised beds. So accessibility. Accessibility is the quality of being easily reached or used. It allows for access to plants and the area in general. You want room to walk and room to bring in items used in gardening, such as wheelbarrows. There's nothing more frustrating than having a raised bed that is inconveniently placed. I know this because I built some in the past where it was really hard to access them. You could get to it, but you couldn't really bring any other equipment in. So I would have a wheelbarrow quite a distance away and I was taking big buckets of soil over to it. It was very inconvenient. So I learned the hard way and from experience that accessibility really is important for everyone. If you need wheelchair access, you can build raised beds or buy raised beds that have wheelchair access. And accessibility is a way you need a way to access plants without stepping on them. This is important. You don't want to step on your plants, but you don't want to compact your soil where you plan to plant. Over time, if you keep walking on the soil surface, it mashes it down, it compacts it, and it makes it harder for you to grow plants in it. So have a way in and out and through if you can. Let's watch another video.
So now we're going to talk about accessibility. This bed here was built for wheelchair access. The pathways are wide so that a person in a wheelchair can move freely in this area. By having such a tall bed, it's possible to dig in the soil and work with plants very easily. You can see that if you had a wheelchair, you can move the wheelchair around and sit in different places. Over here, you can see that this was not built for wheelchair access. It's a little too narrow for that. So the front beds with lots of room and safe sloping areas make it much easier for wheelchair access.
So I want to make a comment about this video as well. I initially put in decomposed granite so that there could be wheelchair access, but I found that over time, the easiest access isn't just space, but also the type of ground cover that's there. I have decomposed granite in this area, but it would have been a better option, I think, for the wheelchair to be accessible via a concrete pathway around the raised bed. That would give a surface that doesn't have any give and therefore better traction. And putting the brakes on the wheelchair is much easier on a concrete surface from my experience. Oops, I skipped a slide. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's talk about weeding and mulching. You might find it surprising that you do need to mulch your raised beds or find some way to put something on the surface that helps reduce weeds. Weeds are reduced in raised beds that are not growing directly into the ground. That's because if you use landscape fabric, you greatly decrease weeds from the bottom. Some people use cardboard and some use newspaper to achieve the same effect. They break down and just become part of the soil. I use landscape fabric, but this is just a personal preference because there are different materials that can be used. Mulching is an option for an aerial weed attack. So you can see in this picture that there is straw spread across the surface. It keeps weeds from landing in and taking root. So the way this works is that if you have the surface covered, obviously weed seeds that fly in or grass seeds that fly in don't have a surface to contact in order to grow. Now, you can't reduce it 100%. You're going to get some weeds from an aerial attack, but straw or some type of mulch really does help a lot. Intensive gardening is another method that is used to prevent or reduce weeds. Remember that intensive gardening is where all those plants are kind of packed in together. That just reduces the amount of available space for weeds to go in. You can put plants in in-ground raised beds that also act as a ground cover around your plants. So there are quite a few options, and I think that it's worthwhile to take a moment to look at different ways to prevent weeds. It'll save you later on, trust me. All right, let's keep going. All right, let's talk about maintenance. So organic matter breaks down, which decreases the soil level. And when you first build a raised bed, what's going to happen is that the soil you put in there that's all nice and smooth and up to the top will, over the course of just a few weeks, considerably go down. That's because everything will start settling, you'll water, and you'll find that the volume of soil you put in isn't enough. So have some extra bags on hand to add to the soil, and keep an eye on the soil level over time. What I do is that as the season goes on, I keep some composted manure, and composted is important there because the nitrogen is less likely to burn your plants and seedlings. But composted manure, I keep it handy and I just sprinkle it over the top and around the plants as I see that level changing throughout the season. So you need to add the soil to maintain the level. Materials vary, and so maintenance varies when we're talking about the actual beds that you've built. So remember, there are two kinds of maintenance we're discussing here. One is maintaining your soil level, and one is maintaining the materials that your bed is made out of. In the picture here on the left, you can see there is a container there, and then in the very back, you see kind of an yellowy orange liquid and some rags. I'm putting a horticultural outdoor oil that's made for preserving raised beds on there. And there are lots on the market. I don't recommend one particular type. They all have merit, and I suggest you do your research and look at what works best for you. But I use an outdoor finishing oil in order to maintain the beds that I've put in. Some people choose to paint their beds or otherwise finish them. You'll want to make sure you're choosing non-toxic, food-safe materials if you ever plan or think you might put food in the beds when you consider finishes for your raised beds. All right, it is time once again for a video. Let me just admit it, I am purely a nerd. And so forgive my lack of video capability here. All right, here we go.
So now we're going to talk about watering, maintenance, including weeding, and soil. When you talk about watering raised beds, there are some differences between raised beds that are in ground and constructed raised beds. For in ground, the water stays longer. However, in a constructed raised bed, the difference is that you'll probably need to water a little bit more. The other concern that you need to think about is that when you're talking about weeding, there are very big differences. For example, these raised beds are on top of landscape fabric. The weeds don't come from below. The only weeds that seem to affect these are weeds that fly in from the air. So for these, the maintenance is much easier. And when we discuss maintenance, we need to talk about the soil. Over time, as soil breaks down, it settles. So every season, compost must be added in order to maintain the height of the soil. When we talk about weeding in general, these in-ground beds take a lot more maintenance than these constructed raised beds. Here, the soil has weeds coming from below as well as on top. So these take a little bit more work to maintain.
So in the video, I said they take a little bit more work to maintain. That is an understatement. These typically get nutsedge and other things in them, this particular raised bed. And I spend, I think, more time cleaning these out, or this one out, than I do combined all of my other raised beds. So just keep that in mind. They work well, and the soil in here is probably the best soil in my garden. But you know, there's a trade-off for that. So now to the main point. We've talked about soil, we've talked about drainage, we've talked about maintenance and accessibility, and the height of the beds. We need to talk about watering as well. And the main thing I need to say about that is that you need access to water, right? You're going to need supplemental irrigation. And throughout the rest of the presentation, you're going to see examples. And so I'll point out the different types of irrigation available there. You have a lot of options from ready to go grow bags to woodworking or concrete projects. Let's first take a look at a manufactured raised bed kit. So I did some research on this one, and this is a great option if you don't have any woodworking equipment or don't have the means or ability to work with wood, or just not the desire to do so. And so this is a really great option. These have brackets on the corners and have sides that are made of composite material. For this particular one, it's listed that it's food safe and that it's constructed of a wood plastic composite. And it's got sustainable sourced wood fibers and high density polypropylene, which is just a fancy word for a type of plastic. And so they're mixed together and made into sides. Okay, this is just one example of many out of many. So if you don't really want to build them, but you want raised beds, this is a really great option. So here is another. These have brackets and they've got that composite. These are 3-year-old beds and they're made of a composite material as well. They're wooden resin. And the person who provided these pictures told me that they have some bowing, but that they're holding strong, right? Note that very few products actually resist the Texas sun, okay? Very few. So, it's just a matter of time where you're going to need to replace things. So you got to keep that in mind. But there are some types of raised beds that we'll show in just a moment that are pretty indestructible. I want you to notice also in this picture that there are trees growing in these beds quite successfully, actually. And so you can grow anything in a raised bed. And that's just one of the great things about the flexibility of raised beds. I think a video is next. Here we go.
Here, I'm standing in a raised bed as well. You might be surprised to learn that raised beds also include in-ground raised beds. The difference between an in-ground raised bed and just in-ground planting is that in in-ground raised beds, the soil has been built up. In this case, the natural soil here is clay. We're in Texas. So what I do is I add composted manure with humus, and over time, the soil becomes workable. Clay holds a lot of minerals and nutrients. So if you can get the clay soil to release those nutrients, your plants can be very strong and healthy.
All right. So key factor and takeaway is that there are a lot of options for raised beds. We've looked at manufactured raised beds. Now we've looked at in-ground burns or just raised up soil. And so let's explore some other types. All right. So let's look at the progression of this in-ground raised bed. This one has no bottom, meaning that the soil is dug into down below. There's no surface barrier like landscape fabric. So in this in-ground raised bed progression, you see soil preparation on the left, and you see a border being put in. You see drip irrigation. So those little, looks like wires, but they're actually tubes with holes in them, and the holes are pointed downwards so that the water goes directly into the soil. It's known as drip irrigation, and it's a very nice way to avoid wasting water. Water is wasted when it goes outside of the bed, when it gets when it evaporates in the air, especially on a hot day. So if you can place drip irrigation in your raised beds, then the water will go deep down into the soil and very little is wasted. Another thing to note about that is that when you use drip irrigation, you avoid getting water on your leaves, or you almost avoid getting water on your leaves. There's some leaves will get water, but nothing like they do when you water from above. So the advantage of that is fewer diseases. A lot of diseases happen because plant leaves are wet. So you want to, regardless of your raised bed, try to water your plants at their bases, not on their leaves. And that is no more apparent than with roses. Do not water the leaves of your roses. Water at the base, just so you know. All right. Finally, in the last picture, you see the food crops, and they look strong and healthy. So, the preparation of the soil, the border, the irrigation, the stepping stones throughout, so there's room to access and you're not compacting the soil, and then the completed bed. Very nice pictures. All right. So I'm going to briefly discuss each of these. The first on the left is flagstone covering cinder block. Now, with that, it's a permanent type of structure. The one on the left is more than a decade old and looks exactly like it looked the day it was put in. It's no different. It is a strong, firm surface. The flagstone has been cemented to the cinder block so that the cinder block is not visible. So that was done not only to give a surface to walk on and to sit on, but it's for aesthetic value. In front of it, you can see that there's a raised up area of soil. So that's also considered a raised bed. and roses and dianthus are there and give at this time and give a kind of an aesthetic value to the potager garden. Okay. Notice the supports in the back. There are bamboo supports for climbing vegetables. And let's move on to the second one. This one is concrete as well. It's got cinder block. And you can see that on the right, there are capstones or pavers that are placed there for seating, which is really kind of great. You can't see it in the picture on the far left, but in the back, there's cinder block that is not covered. And in that, I put flowers and things that kind of enhance it. So I can cover the look of cinder block in the back row and add a flower border. Okay. One really cool thing about cinder block is that you can completely remove a side and then change the configuration. So when you have cinder block, not only is it durable, long lasting, and really has zero maintenance other than maybe spraying it down once in a while with water to clean it off. But it allows you to reconfigure the structure that you have. So for example, you've made a small cinder block raised bed and you've been planting, but now you need more space. Well, you just take out a side or two sides, like picking them up one at a time. It's a little bit of labor, but then you can move those out, prepare that soil, fill that space with soil and compost, and now you have more room to grow. They can, the same is true with the growing bags. So growing bags allow a lot of change as well. And if they're small growing bags, you can bring them in. You've got to look at the different manufacturers. I've had grow bags that are small and that can be lifted by the handles, but the bigger the growing bag, the less it's recommended that you pick them up by their handles because you could break the bag at that point. One other option that I've seen is that a person will take a piece of wood or MDF or something and put some casters on the bottom and then put these grow bags on those. Now they're able to move them. And so people will plant things in them. And then when there are freezes or unexpected freezes, really, rather than just covering them, they can just wheel them into the garage for the night or for as long as they need. Okay, keep going here. All right, notice the size of these beds, and they're quite large. They have the pavers on top of the bricks. The inner entrance has a lot of room to walk around these beds. So there's a ton of space, and I see mulch on the ground for drainage and for accessibility. Nobody likes walking through mud to get to their raised beds. So you want something on the ground. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just needs to be functional. People put sand, mulch, decomposed granite, gravel. You know, I've seen smooth rocks and stones. All right, back to cinder block again, durable. Accessibility, you see that this raised bed, they have some sides that are taller than others. They're changing the configuration there. There's also the cattle panel. That's that archway that you see there. And they are extremely useful and they're inexpensive and they're durable. So you get a lot from that. Lots can be grown vertically, such as small melons, cucumbers, butternut squash, and pole beans. I've grown all of those on different types of arbors. It saves space, it increases your yields, and it decreases diseases because the plants that are on them can get more air from multiple directions. It's better for the plants to have air than on this type of structure than to put them on the ground where they're sprawling around, sitting in water, they're crowded. Your melons kind of get that spot on the bottom. So these are a really great option. Large melons, they have a little more trouble with large melons, but I've seen it done. And I've seen slings that are made out of ladies' hosiery, like stockings, used to hold the melons onto the cattle panel. So a lot of options. And I highly encourage you, if you're interested in that, into looking into that and looking at ways people have built them. You also may see some supports here to hold the cattle panel in place. Okay, let's move on. So brackets for corners. So here are some basic metal brackets. To use these, you just screw them into boards you've purchased. Usually with these types of brackets, a wood size is suggested. So they'll say, get these brackets for 8-inch boards, or get these brackets for, 5.5-inch boards or whatnot. Some types have been adapted for stacking, and so you can have multiple layers, so you can get the depth that you're looking for. All right. Another option is to use concrete bricks that have a space that's specifically made to put a piece of wood. So you can see in the far right picture that there are multiple options. You can continue to connect them on all 4 sides. These are stackable. Notice the PVC piping in the second picture. It can be used to add netting against bugs or to add frost blankets. You might also notice in the far right picture, the third picture on the right, that there's a sprinkler head there. And so that's used for watering, obviously, right? Sprinkler head. But so you can incorporate them around your sprinkler heads. The cinder block and what are they called? Flagstone bed that I showed you a few slides ago has sprinklers in it as well. And so when I know I can't water, I'll use the sprinklers. And I don't like to use the sprinklers in my raised beds because of the leaves getting wet, but they really work in a pinch when I don't have time, and they are effective. So, all right. This is a picture of one of the many demonstration gardens available to the public. It's located at the Fort Bend County Extension Office. These beds are in the midst of being constructed in this picture. They're now done and they have soil in them. And they're constructed to demonstrate growing vegetables. Once they're complete with everything in them and everything's growing, the food will be donated to the local food bank. You can come out and visit this space and many other gardens that we have. This is a location, it's adjacent to the Fort Bend County Fairgrounds. I want you to notice several things about this raised bed area. Notice the rainwater collection. There are silos in the back. You see the metal collection containers. They kind of look like grain silos, but smaller. And they collect water off that rooftop and are used to water these beds. And there's piping throughout these this area in order to water. And it's a very cool system. Not really what people use, sprinkler system combined with it at home, but you can have a rain collection barrel or 2 or multiple, depending on the size of your property. You can collect the rainwater, and we get plenty of rain here, and then you can use it on your garden. You can save water that way. And so that's something I'm working on establishing in my own yard, because it's a waste just to let it run off. And it's a much better option to collect it and to use that water. Notice also that they're measuring in here to make sure that these are the same distance away and to allow for access of machinery and equipment to maintain the beds. And these beds were really easy to construct. They just have 4 corners, and now they have braces in the center to give them stability, but they were simple raised beds to build. And it was quite a fun build as well. I got to participate in this. All right, let's watch a video.
So here we have the simplest raised beds one can build. They are made entirely of 2x8s. They're cut 4 pieces and bolted together. Nothing to them. They're not as deep as the other beds, so I typically use them for annuals and quick growing plants like peas and beans.
Right. You'll see the progression of this and how this area was built in another slide. And here's that slide. Here's the progression of a simple bed construction. So the way this was done is that the grass was removed on the side yard. many of us have side yards that are just grass and they're not used for anything. So I decided to turn it into a little garden area. In this area, French drains were installed as the area was prone to flooding, and there's damage to the fence line because of it, because of that flooding. So we wanted to prevent damage to any future fences. Sand was used to provide a solid foundation for the next layer. So underneath the landscape fabric, there's sand. A thick landscape fabric was added, like a commercial type. And I did this work myself. So it is definitely doable. Not only did I do it myself, I did it by myself without any help from anybody else. And so it can be done by a single person. And this was really economical after the French drains. Let's see. The bed was constructed of 2x8 inch boards. It's not deep enough. It's not following the protocols that I laid out earlier. And so that's why I don't put anything that needs depth. These are usually for annuals, and it's kind of for show and enjoyment. But I do grow things vertically on this, and you can see the structure on the side for vertical growth. And I'll talk about that in a bit. All right, so this is another raised bed that I tend to build quite often. It has 4x4s on the outside to support the top. So you can see in the first picture, there's one on each end, and then there are 3 along the length of it. These are about 6 feet long. The longer they are, the more supports I put. Let's see, these are 18 inches, including the top. All I did was take these 4, I screwed them together, and then put the top on. And these are like dinosaurs. These don't move. They will be there forever until they break down, because these are incredibly sturdy and heavy. It was very useful to have someone hold the sides together as I drilled the holes. And you'll want to pre-drill holes when you make these. I'll talk about this in a video in just a moment. This is an economical bed, and it's made out of fir and pine. The 4x4s are fir, Douglas fir, and then the slats or sides are made out of pine. Now, it won't last as long as a cedar bed because it's not naturally rot resistant like cedar is, but it does do the job. So we're going to talk about building a cedar bed in the next video. So here's a video of building a cedar bed. This was built last weekend. So I built it in time for this so you guys can kind of see how it goes. So let's take a look at that.
Hello, so here we are again. I'm building
I'm going to see if I can turn up the volume. Nope.
a cedar raised bed. This has been built on a flat surface and moved to this angled surface so I could do the top in the shade. It's a hot day. All right, so a couple of things that you need to know when you're building beds. When you build cedar beds or any other wooded beds, you need to think about safety. I've got eye protection, respiratory protection, and ear protection. So I protect my lungs, my eyes, and my hearing. All right, let's get started. So first, notice that I have stacked 3 fence pickets high, one 2x2 support that goes nearly to the ground, but not quite. And the smaller fence pickets are along the edges in order to add support. Notice these extra little blocks, these support the shorter sides. So the way I do the top is I put the top like this, the piece here, and measure the distance I want and cut 2 like that. Then I fit these between and mark the size I want. Notice that this piece will go into this corner. All right, I'll show you the finished bed in the pictures after this video.
So I did misspeak. The longer sides are supported by those little corners. There are corners that are 2x2s in each of the 4 corners that go all the way to the ground. Then there are 4 little blocks, one at each corner, that is screwed in to that main piece. And those little blocks support those long sides. You'll find that when you construct beds and you're trying to put a top on, you need support for the top. Now notice that this is just fence pickets. I just bought fence pickets to make this and some 2x2s. That's it. And the thing is that you need to see that there are supports in the inside. Those are the ones that don't go to the ground, but those supports are used to support the top level, you know, the top piece that, and this is not for sitting on. The reason why you can't sit on this one is that the slats are just too thin. So if you plan to sit on the raised bed, you need a wider, thicker board that you use for this.
Hello.
So here's a picture of the completed piece. Again, safety is the main priority. You want to follow precautions when you use any kind of tools, and you want to learn to use them properly before you start your project. So as I built my woodworking skills, I would always practice. Once I'd learned how the tool works, I would take safety precautions and I would practice on scrap pieces first, so that when I did my actual pieces, I wasn't learning on them, right? Another thing that you really want to do, even if the screws you buy say otherwise, you'll want to pre-drill your holes with a drill bit that is smaller than the size of the screw, but not too much smaller. That way, any resistance you get with a drill bit, and you don't split your wood. It's very frustrating to have pieces all cut and you're ready to go, and then you mess up a piece of wood and you don't have extra. So whenever I build a raised bed, I always get an extra piece or two of each type of material. In this case, an extra 2x2 and an extra fence picket, so that I can account for problems that might arise. This bed is about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide. It's a pretty good sized bed, and it's about 17 inches. I think it will be adequate for the growth that will be done, but I could have put another fence picket high and it would have been a nice, tall, deep bed that I could grow anything in. The lumber and screws for this, since I did it last weekend, I have a price for you. This one cost me about $205 for this large bed. I priced out some years ago someone making them for me, and the price was more than double the price that of the materials here. So you do save money by doing it yourself. This one was cedar, so the wood was more expensive than the Douglas fir and the pine that I used in the previous beds. So here, I want you to notice we're looking at additions to raised beds. This is a raised bed with tomato cages on it. They can be used for several types of plants, including peppers and of course tomatoes. Notice the corners, there are 4 support corners. The sides are screwed in or nailed into those corners, and water is accessible via a hose. So you've seen drip irrigation, you've seen rain collection, and you've seen just a hose, right? So those are 3 options for water. The cattle panel is here, and we talked about how cattle panel can be used for multiple things. I also want you to notice the galvanized tub. They can be used for composting with the bottom cut out. So if you cut off the bottom of a galvanized pail and stick it in the ground, you can add things to it and allow for decomposition there. And then you can, when it's broken down nicely and you can see you've got soil, you can then spread that amongst your garden. You can also use these for deep-rooted vegetables like carrots. Carrots need a deeper soil, and so a galvanized tub can allow for that into soil that is easier to access. Clay is hard to grow carrots in, and so this gives you another option. So these here have seating on the edges for convenience. That means the side panels are thicker and they've got supports on the outside. These have been finished with a non-toxic, food-safe paint, and there are lots of different types out there nowadays. I chose cocoa because this is part of my garden theme, so I like the cocoa color. Here we've got tomato supports and wires for grapes, as well as tomato pepper cages that are used to support tomatoes, peppers, and grapes. The grapes have been trained to the top wire, so they're in raised beds. These raised beds go directly into the soil, so the sides are not as tall, but the soil below has been amended. I've got wooden slats that are used, they're temporary, and they're secured via a hole that's been drilled to the top of them, and then they're secured with twist ties, garden twist ties onto the wire. On the top, the grapes are on the top, and some of them are still on the bottom in this picture. So vertical gardening is a really nice thing to do when you have a smaller yard. Very, very useful. On the right, you see the tomato cages. They're in this picture, they're used to support peppers. All right, so let's talk about ways to grow even a little bit outside of the season. Here's an example of a cold frame that I made to sit on top of a raised bed. This one features glass windows so that you can maximize the sunlight. There are 4 doors for cross ventilation and access, and fence latches are used to prevent any horizontal movement. In the last picture, the grapevines and roses are supported by 2 4x4s that are concreted into place, and a metal central support unseen in the picture is in the center. Wire vices are installed in the posts, and wires are inserted to support the grapes and the roses that come in from the side. So there are roses coming in from the side and grapes coming from the inside out. And again, the grapes are planted into the ground directly. And the wire vices were really easy to put in. I didn't have any experience with them, and they were easy. You just drill a hole, you put them in, and you screw in the screws, and that's it. And the wire goes only one direction. So every season or two, I tighten those wires to keep that wire taut. And there are different types of designs and models. There's a lot out there. This is made out of pine and fir, and then a sealant has been placed on it. I use a marine sealant for that. All right, so here's a video.
So now I'm going to talk to you about additional structures you can place in raised beds. In this case, I built a small greenhouse or cold frame so that I can grow vegetables year round. I placed glass in here. This is 1/8 inch, just annealed glass, regular glass. I've routed the edges and placed the glass inside. The advantage of having this is that I can not only grow food in the winter that doesn't normally grow in the winter, but I can start seedlings for the rest of the garden quite early. In this case right now, I've got okra that started that will go out in the main garden when the broccoli comes out. I've got basil, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, and some lettuces and eggplant. So in this case, a lot of these plants will be moved out to the rest of the garden, but I gave them a head start and saved myself some money as well, because I didn't have to buy plants. I was able to buy seeds.
All right, other features, hooks are placed on the outside of this raised bed. They're used to hold small tools such as spades, and they're always available. I lose everything that is not attached to me. Okay, seriously, I have so many spades, and I tend to bury them in my raised beds, and I find them seasons later. So to kind of prevent that, I just finished off some little hooks, and I sprayed them with a water sealant as well after I painted them. And then I just hung them on there, and that made it really easy. I drill a hole in the wooden handles of my tools and string through some leather strapping, and then I hang them. And so it's ornamental, but it's really functional. The next picture shows where you can add on the front, if you have a thick enough side, you can add a basket and put a liner. This is used for holding ornamentals. It's not only for aesthetic value, but I put in there flowers that attract pollinators. So I'm hoping, the hope is that while they stop by to look at the plants they really want, they'll take a look at the flowers behind and do some pollinating for me. So that's the hope, right? Anyway. All right, and additional supports. So here you see a squash tunnel is used to support vines. Notice accessibility is there via stepping stones, and there's drainage that's by French drains and decomposed granite. This also slopes slightly away because after having flooding in this area, I don't feel like I can ever have enough great drainage. So anyway, well, that just about wraps things up. If these supporting topics interest you, you're in luck. Throughout the year, many of these topics are covered in classes available through our local extension office through the Grow Your Own series. And of course, if you really want to take a deep dive into these topics, you really do, consider becoming a Master Gardener. The Master Gardener program allows you to learn about these topics and more, and it allows you to share your newfound knowledge to help other gardeners and the community at large, which is what I'm doing right now. There are some upcoming classes. There's the Landscape Success Series has flowering plants for 4 seasons. That's on April 21st, and it's at 2 p.m. Then there's another Grow Your Own, and they're going to talk about warm season vegetables and herbs, and that's on May 14th at 9 a.m. All right. All right. Where's my team? I think we're getting ready now for questions and answers. Whoops, sorry. I clicked off too fast.
Okay, the first question we have is straws any better than wood mulch in vegetable gardens? So mulching material for the raised beds.
Ms. Chan, since you have straw in yours, would you like to answer that question? What do you think?
Well, I use straw because they're pretty light for me. I can't lift a lot of heavy stuff. Bags of mulch is now a little bit of a challenge for me to lug by myself. And it's also easier to get rid of. Part of the consideration is the process of the mulching material also decomposing, and how much work do you want to go through to kind of clean it up when you incorporate additional nutrient and or compost on top. Straw is pretty easy for me to just rake up and remove, and then that way I can enrich the soil. But wood mulch, Boone, in the past when we chat about that, then we said something about the wood mulch really is much better for trees and not necessarily for beds.
Well, the main thing, and there's a really detailed read that I put in the chat feature there, discusses just the length of time that it takes for the cellulose and wood mulches to decompose in those beds, and so you get a lot of nutrient binding through that process, and it takes years for that type of material to decompose versus pine needles and straw mulches that are brittle and that break down by the end of that growing season, so they can be effectively incorporated into the soil, and they'll decompose very fast.
Okay, so the next question is, how often do you empty your raised beds and start over with new soil and compost?
The answer to that is never. I never start over again, because the micronutrients and the life in the soil is worth keeping. So I just amend my beds. I add soil to the top. I try not to till the soil too much. I just turn it over just enough and to the least depth I can to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. So I kind of want to leave it alone as much as I can. My soil is really, really, really full of worms, and I try not to disturb them if I can. So
what about for potted planters or grow bags? Do you empty those or remix them?
Well, sometimes they get compacted, the soil compacts and they seem to dry out faster. So what I'll do is I'll take some of the soil out and then I'll replace it. If that really doesn't work and the plant is really struggling, I try to look at, is it in a place that gets too much sun or not enough sun? Does it have proper drainage? If all of those things are fine, then there are times that I've changed out smaller planters of soil. But usually the thing is that I put the wrong kind of soil in to begin with. Like for me, I used to put just, regular potting soil. in all of my planters, but that just doesn't work for the bigger ones. And in the summer, it doesn't even work for my smaller ones because they just dry out so fast. I can't water them enough. I need something that holds water a little bit more. So
Okay, next question is how do you heat the small greenhouse?
how do I heat it?
Yes.
I don't, the sun of the day. So what I do is when the winter was here, when we had winter, I keep the doors closed for much of that time. And the sun, the rays of the sun come through the glass and warm the air in there. The air in that little greenhouse will be considerably warmer than the air outside. So what's really neat that I really like doing, I know I'm a little weird, but when it's cold outside and there's even ice on the outside of the glass, I'll open it and I'll get this warm burst of steam in my face. It's really wonderful. So it keeps itself warm enough. And I started lots and lots of seeds in there. Like okra really likes the heat, and it did quite well there. It came up quickly and it seemed very happy in there. So in the heat, I have to open it. So every morning I go out when there's going to be a nice day and I open 2 windows, kind of like an X-wing, I open it and allow for circulation and for pollination, because now my tomatoes are needing pollinating. So.
Okay, the next question is building plans for raised beds and greenhouse topper.
There are tons, and I do mean tons, of plans. There are lots of videos on YouTube, Etsy, YouTube, Pinterest, and just looking around, you can find, just a search on Google or, on Firefox, you can find so many designs and you can find free ones. I started with some that were free where I had an option to make a donation. So I made a small donation and got really great support. And I needed the support when I first started building raised beds. So, but there are tons of plans, and you can look around at different designs and kind of get an idea of how they were made. But it's really about measuring what space you need and how big you want them to be.
Okay, Boone, did you have anything else to add to Ken's question here regarding raised bed plans?
No, I think Sam nailed it pretty good. Sam, do you have any measurement drawings for the specs on the one that you did build?
I did. I took some measurements but I don't have them typed up as of yet,
Okay.
but I can get those done.
Yeah, maybe what we'll do on that, just at your leisure, just bring those into the Master Gardener hotline office.
Okay,
And then if there's people that would want a copy of that, then our hotline team can give that out.
awesome. That'd be nice.
We could potentially make it into an article to post it on there. So it's a bit more permanent even.
Mhm. There was a video, there's a really great video on raised beds on the AgriLife website for Texas A&M University. And it was specifically on raised beds. And it was showing a simple one, a simple raised bed construction. So check that out if you get a chance.
Okay.
Next question. Any other questions?
So another question, will double ground mulch decompose faster or be okay for vegetables?
Double ground mulch?
Yeah, this is Adam. Adam, do you want to ask the question live?
Hi, Adam.
Hi. Yeah. So I noticed that some of the garden centers, they have like double ground mulch. It's just like wood mulch that's like finely ground up to a finer consistency.
Mm-hmm. I think that mulch is great, and I think the finer consistency would likely break down faster. But you need some type of soil or compost in the beds. I do a
Yeah.
mixture of like part topsoil and more decomposed or
Yeah, the beds
compost.
are already filled. I'm talking about as mulch.
Oh, as mulch. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that would work. That would work as long as it's pretty well broken down. I'd have to agree with Angela on the pain in the bottom nature of having big chunks of wood in a raised bed. It's harder to remove it. I have I have mulch in other parts of my yard around my trees and whatnot. But in my raised beds, I use what's called intensive gardening, where I just pack my plants in closer. Since they have really good soil, I just try to block the surface, but I think straw and pine needles work really, really well. But I think you could do that as long as it's easy enough for you to use and move around so that you can amend the soil and plant in it.
Yeah, just to make sure that any fresh material, even if they are grounded up, do not mix them into the soil, just leave them on the top because it will rob nitrogen away from the soil in order to decompose.
Yeah.
All right. Next one question is, how do you get worms in your soil? They just
Well,
come.
Well, they come if you have the bottom open, right?
Yes.
So, for me personally, I can tell you what I do, but this is not a recommendation to do this or whatever. There are lots of options, right? But I put worm castings in mine, and worm castings are going to have, worms in it. So that's how I kind of got them into my garden.
Okay. The next question
Mhm.
is on potting mix. What
Mhm.
formula do you use?
Well, there are a lot of options, right? I pretty much move around. I use very inexpensive composted manure. It's the cheapest one I can get that's organic. You can find this at many of the big box stores. It's not the fancy one with the pretty. I don't use the ones with the pretty pictures on them unless I'm just topping off my beds and feel lazy. And it's not laziness to use them. I just prefer not to spend more money on it. And composted manure, organic sources are pretty much what I use. So there are multiple brands that I use. In the Master Gardener program, we don't recommend one brand over another. But honestly, I just go to one of my local box stores, and I think mine is like $1.62 a bag. And the bags are reasonable sizes. And so works great for me. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is on if you add rose soil in your veggie beds, do you clean them out before you start over for the next season?
I've learned that I don't put roses in with other plants other than other flowers. I found that roses take different types of care than my vegetables, and they're different types of care that they don't mix as well. Rose soil I do use sometimes in my rose garden, but I found that, again, the composted manure is kind of a everywhere kind of thing, Roses also, for me, I have two different kinds of roses. I have earth kind roses that just no matter what I do to them, they're wonderful. They don't get diseases and they're great. It's called earth kind. And then I have more traditional roses, and those are a pain. And I have to put horticultural oils and whatnot on those to keep them from having diseases. So, but yeah, so.
Oh, excellent. We have a few comments about using mushroom compost as well as leaf mold compost. And some of our wranglers also have shared link and related to mulching for raised beds or mulching in general. We will provide those links to everybody in the follow-up emails, including a link to the recording of this class so we can have this for future reference and review as well. Thank you, everybody. I think that's the last of the questions and comments. Thank you, everybody, for joining and sign up for our future classes, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.